In our series on peacemaking, we're acknowledging the fact that Jesus is present with us in community and that Jesus' presence brings his peace. And with his peace comes a promise that he'll not only be with us, but that he'll help us, that he'll empower us, that he'll encourage us. Today, as we come into toward the end of Matthew 18, we have one more section next week. As we come to this passage, we address our cultural value of community and specifically how we deal with conflict in community in such a way to preserve community and not destroy community. What's conflict? Conflict is any situation where our concerns and desires different from each other's. And that's a pretty big topic. So there's really no way to avoid conflict for a few reasons. One, we live in a broken world. We're bound to hurt each other. Secondly, we're all different from each other, and therefore we will all see things differently from each other. We're bound to have conflict. And third is because we're part of a spiritual battle where Satan, who is the great divider, loves to take our differences and our brokenness and magnify them and cause them to create disunity rather than unity. In Jesus' great prayer in John chapter 17, he prayed to the Father. He says, "Father, may they be one, just as you are in me and I am in you." For what purpose? So that the world may believe that you have sent me. In other words, the quality of our community, the unity that marks our church, becomes a witness to the world that in fact God has sent Jesus to save the world. And the opposite is true. The disunity of the body caused by conflict destroys our witness. And so that the world no longer listens to the message that Jesus actually came to save us, because if he's come to save us, why aren't we different? So this message today is part confession and part commitment on my part. Okay, ready for the first confession? I hate conflict. Matter of fact, I'm conflicted about even giving a message on conflict this morning. But secondly, I'm committed to getting better at it. And I want us to get better at it as a church. It's an area that I want us to grow in as a staff, as leadership, and our congregation. I want us to get better at acknowledging that there is conflict, that conflict is normal. And to commit to each other to get better at dealing with it. And Jesus' passage here in Matthew 18 gives us some really good principles on how we might deal with conflict within the body of Christ. You ready? Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. If a brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there I am with them. It's interesting that this would be a passage that would help us deal with conflict, because even as you read this passage, there may be some conflict inside of you with Jesus about how he stated these things. This is a seminal passage on resolving conflict, dealing with conflict. But it's also a very difficult passage for us. Jesus talks about tax collectors and pagans in a way here that he doesn't talk about elsewhere. And it makes us wonder, what exactly does Jesus mean by that? The second part of this, talking about binding and loosing, agreeing together, we're going to address next week as we look at the topic of hope for forgiveness. So I'd like to focus on the first verse of this passage. That'll give us some hint at how we can begin to address conflict within community in a way that is helpful. and healthy. The first principle we learn in this passage is that we acknowledge conflict. We acknowledge conflict. Jesus says, if a brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault. He commands us. He asks us to acknowledge the conflict between us. Now, here's what I wish the fill in the blank was. We avoid conflict. Many of you know my story, my life, two defining moments in my life that really shaped who I am even today. One was the death of my younger brother, Christopher, when he was 3 years old and I was 9. And second was my parents' divorce that began when they separated. I was 11 years old. In both of those events, what I remember most vividly is the desire for our family to avoid conflict associated with those two events. We were more concerned about people feeling hurt or angry or disappointed about those events rather than dealing with the events themselves. The cardinal sin in our house was to make anybody upset. Don't talk about it. They'll get upset. Don't bring it up. It won't make any difference. So honestly, I've been trained. Part of my upbringing is to ignore conflict and hope that it'll just go away. I don't want to deal with it. I want to pretend it's not there. But I realize conflict is inevitable. And whether I deal with it personally with someone or not, conflict will happen. But others of us would fill in the blank with maybe we enjoy conflict. Some of us have grown up in a family where there was always conflict. No resolution or forgiveness, just a lot of conflict. And our hearts have been trained to just keep life at a high-pitched yell. Be in your face. If I feel something, I'm going to tell it to you right now. I've got to get it off my chest. I'm going to throw it against the wall and see what sticks. Most of us don't grow up in families where we deal with conflict in a healthy way. And yet when we come together as this mystical communion, this body of Christ that's marked by Jesus' name, we come together as brothers and sisters. We're like family. And if you take all of our different family experiences and put them together, we're already in conflict over the way we deal with conflict. So what's a healthy way to deal with conflict? Jesus says we first acknowledge it. And we acknowledge it with humility. Going back to the first value that Neil talked about in peacemaking. Paul says in Galatians 6:1, brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves. This is a great warning. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. In other words, the way we acknowledge conflict, the way we confront conflict, can itself be sin. We can address conflict with pride and arrogance, believing that we are absolutely right, and if we do that, we are tempted to sin. He calls us to confront or to acknowledge sin, but to do it well. Paul also says in Ephesians, don't let the sun go down on your anger and don't let the devil get a foothold. By our postponing the acknowledgement of conflict, we allow Satan to sow seeds of disagreement and disunity within the church. We allow him to sow seeds of resentment and bitterness and anger that eventually leads to something worse often than the issue we had conflict over. And maybe even just leave the community without ever resolving that issue. So how do we do it? Jesus says we not only acknowledge the conflict, but we talk to people, not about people. Jesus says, if a brother or sister sins, go and point out that fault just between the two of you. Why? There's great wisdom here because it makes conflict management it focuses conflict management on the smallest circle possible before it goes to a wider audience. I have a friend who, when he hears me complain about someone else, he'll immediately say, well, have you told that person? And more often than not, I haven't. Why do we talk to the other person? First, because talking to the other person honors them and builds them up. It gives them a chance for iron to sharpen iron. Paul says in Ephesians 4, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Often, the conflict that we sense, the disagreement that we have, often is God's prodding us to help that other person to grow. It honors them and builds them up. It gives them the benefit of the doubt. It honors them by them hearing the conflict first before the neighborhood does, or the rest of the family, or the rest of the small group, or the rest of the church. And secondly, it's important for us to talk to people because talking to the person avoids gossip or grumbling. Gossip is when we talk to someone who has no part in the resolution of that conflict. There are some times when we get wise counsel from someone in a situation, and we take them into our confidence, and you say, here's a situation I'm dealing with. Would you help me resolve this? That person actually is part of helping the conflict to be resolved. If that's the way we talk to another person about a conflict, that would be totally appropriate here. But not talking to the person we have the conflict with, and only talking to another is gossip. And it's grumbling. James says, don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. When we talk about others, we often demonize them. The conflict grows. We spread unhelpful information to other people. The conflict then takes on a life of its own, way beyond the original conflict. Even to those people who have no part in the resolution of that conflict. So long after the conflict is resolved, after maybe those people have settled their differences, the people who are not part of that conversation now have not received the grace to deal with the situation like the two people have because they've dealt with it themselves. So long after that conflict is resolved, there's a whole conversation going on out there about this person that is inappropriate and unhelpful. And God does not give His grace to those who are outside of that small circle of those two. Jesus asks us to talk to people because talking to the person gives us a chance to clear up a misunderstanding. Neil talked about humility the first week. Often we think that there's a conflict, but there's a misunderstanding. We think someone meant something by what they said, and actually when we humbly ask them the question, could you tell me more about the comment that you made? We find out that it wasn't at all what we thought it was. We went to the next step of inference. We believed it was something more than what it was. And this is where face-to-face or a phone call is so much more helpful than a letter or an email. Let me give you a couple tips about how to email me. Okay? Number one, I will never respond to an email that doesn't have a name attached to it, or a letter, a note. How unhelpful is that? If we have a conflict, sign your name, make an appointment. And that's true, I think you'd want the same thing, right? How do you respond to a letter that's not signed? And secondly, make sure that the letter that you send me leaves room for a conversation. And I think you'd want that for yourself. When we confront someone face to face, we have the opportunity to see their face. We get to ask for understanding. We have an opportunity to pray together, to seek reconciliation together. Those are just a few tips. Maybe you have your own, ways that you'd like people to respond to you, personally or in a letter, face to face. Gives us an opportunity to learn, to be humble before each other. Third, Jesus says that we ought to overlook minor offenses. Jesus says if a brother or sister sins against you, This passage talks about us confronting each other when there's a sin. Something that we've done against God's law. It doesn't say that we should confront each other when there's a conflict over a preference, a disagreement over an opinion. This is a volitional sin that someone has committed against us. Jesus calls us to bear with one another, to forgive one another, to be patient with one another. And when we look at the offense that the person has against us, the conflict, we have to determine, is this something worth confrontation? Proverbs 19 says, a person's wisdom yields patience. It's to one's glory to overlook an offense. When we're in conflict with one another, it's often helpful to look and see what button is being pushed in me. When I was in seminary, I remember sitting at lunch with a friend and talking about someone, and he says, it's amazing how close your finger is to the trigger with anger. I said, what are you talking about? What do you know, idiot? No, I didn't say that really. I'm just kidding, I didn't say that. Because it had nothing to do with it. It was all about a memory that was being touched. Matter of fact, I have to tell you this because this is too serious of a message. I have to tell you something fun. I get nervous with conflict. On Friday, we were playing in a golf tournament, and a friend was playing with me who's a very, very good golfer. And he noticed something in my swing that was keeping me from hitting the ball straight. Can anybody relate to that? Okay, good. We're all here together. And this is true, right? This is a true story. And so he says, can I give you some feedback on your swing? He said, I'm really reluctant to do it because normally when you do that in the middle of a match, you just ruin people for life, at least for the rest of the round. Now, they're all confused and everything. But he asked the question, he says, did you play any other sports when you were younger? I said, well, yeah, I played basketball, I played baseball, I played a little bit of tennis. He goes, okay, when you hit the ball, I want you to picture that you're hitting a forehand with topspin. Oh, forehand with topspin. The next ball I hit was straight. Why? He said, because you have to identify with a memory that you have. That memory becomes unconscious. Now, that's a positive example of how memory can be unconscious. But there's a negative example as well, where someone says something to us and it pushes a button. And it has little to do with what the person said, the content of what they said, and more to do with the button that's been pushed. When we find ourselves in conflict, there's an opportunity for us to examine, is that a minor offense that just happened to push my button? And if that's the case, maybe there's something that I need to deal with in my life that's a problem for me. Fourth, Jesus says that we confront in order to restore community. We confront in order to restore community. For me, I thought that conflict was all about winning the argument, making sure that I was right and you were wrong. And if we got to that point in the conversation, I'll quit. We're done. But Jesus doesn't say the point of pointing out someone else's fault is to make sure that you're right. He says the point is to win them over, is to restore fellowship. So we look at the way we resolve conflict in our society. We look at the way we resolve conflict in the media. Often people will hold a press conference before they ever talk to a person face to face. They'll file a lawsuit before they ever discuss the issue with someone else. But Jesus says that the goal here is to restore community. Paul says in Romans 12, do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now that's a challenging statement. How in the world do we live at peace with everyone? Because it's as far as it depends on you. There are times when we confront another and it doesn't go so well. It doesn't restore community. We may have to bring someone else along with us the next time to bring objectivity and support to this confrontation because it didn't go well. But it shouldn't not go well because of us. We should make every effort to live at peace, to confront in order to restore community, to seek peace with each other. We can't always dictate someone else's response, but we can control our own behavior. To acknowledge conflict, to talk to people and not about them, to overlook minor offenses, to confront in order to restore community, not to revenge or to hurt another. Which brings us back to what I mentioned last week and the week before about the purpose of the church and how we view the church. We could ask the theological question, what is your ecclesiology? What do you believe about the church? If the church is an institution that is faceless and impersonal, then we can treat each other without regard for relationship. If the church is a market where I get my religious goods and services and go home with no relationship, then I can get what I need, and if I don't get what I need, I can go someplace else. But if the church is the family of God, where we are related to one another, if the church is the body of Christ, where we need one another, if the church is the people of God that are marked by Christ, His life, death, and resurrection, His hope, love, and grace, then we seek to restore community. As we come to the table this morning, we're going to have a time of confession. Because as I'm talking about this, you either have a conflict with me or you recognize a conflict with someone else. I know, preaching this message, that there are personal relationships that I have to deal with that are in conflict right now. I know that, and I feel great conviction about that. And I'm praying about how I might go about doing that. And I'd like you to do the same. I'd like you to take a moment of silence quietly before Josh leads us in a prayer of confession and to simply ask God the question, God, what is it that you want me to know or do differently because of your word? What circumstance, what conflict in my life needs to be dealt with in a Christ-like way? What's my part in it? What are buttons that get pushed in me in conflict situations that maybe I need to deal with personally? Let's spend a few moments in quiet, and then Josh will lead us in a prayer of confession. Let's bow our heads together.